A liberal calculus professor set a trap to humiliate Barron Trump, thinking she had the upper hand. But when he stepped up to the board, what happened next turned the entire class against her. The crisp autumn air carried a slight chill as students streamed into the grand lecture hall at Harvard University's mathematics department, their chatter a mix of nervous anticipation and quiet dread. This wasn't just any class. It was advanced calculus, taught by Dr. Eleanor Sinclair, a woman both revered and feared. A tenured professor with an Ivy League pedigree, Sinclair was known for two things: her brilliant mathematical mind and her unapologetic political stance. Today, however, something felt different. The usual wall-length whiteboard, normally covered in dense equations, was completely blank except for 5 bold words written in red marker, redefining academic priorities in STEM. A murmur passed through the room as students took their seats, puzzled by the unexpected departure from their usual coursework. At the very back of the hall, Barron Trump settled into his usual seat, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Standing at 6'7", he was an imposing figure, but he had always preferred to remain unnoticed. He wasn't here for fanfare or prestige. He was here because he loved mathematics. Barron had spent years mastering calculus, solving problems for fun, even delving into original works of Leibniz and Euler in their native languages. He had no interest in debates, no desire to challenge authority, at least not until today. Dr. Sinclair strode to the podium, adjusting her glasses as she scanned the room with an authoritative gaze. "Before we begin," she started, her voice smooth but firm, "I believe it's time we address an uncomfortable truth about mathematics. For too long, this field has been dominated by a particular group, those with the resources, the connections, and the privilege to succeed." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before adding, "Perhaps we should ask ourselves whether traditional mathematics is truly the fairest measure of intelligence." A tense silence fell over the room. Barron, hands folded neatly on his desk, slowly raised his right hand. A few students exchanged nervous glances. Others leaned in, sensing a confrontation. Dr. Sinclair's lips curled into a slight smirk. "Ah, Mr. Trump," she said, her tone both mocking and expectant. "Do you have something to contribute to this discussion?" The air in the room grew heavier, the stakes becoming clear. This wouldn't just be a calculus class. It was about to become a battlefield. Barron lowered his hand, his expression remaining calm and composed. "Professor," he began, his voice steady and respectful, "I believe mathematics is one of the few fields where merit transcends privilege. Numbers don't care about wealth, politics, or social status. They only care about logic and truth." A murmur rippled through the room, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Some students nodded in quiet agreement, while others, like Nathan Carter, leaned back in their seats with smirks, eagerly anticipating Dr. Sinclair's response. She exhaled sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Is that so?" she mused, tilting her head. "Well then, Mr. Trump, since you believe so strongly in mathematical merit, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate it." Turning to the whiteboard, she grabbed a marker and, with quick, aggressive strokes, began writing an equation. The chalk screeched against the board as symbols and numbers formed an intricate, near impossible calculus problem. Students leaned forward, eyes widening. It wasn't just any equation. It was graduate-level mathematics, well beyond anything covered in the syllabus. Emily Rhodes, a scholarship student and one of the brightest in the class, whispered under her breath, "That's a monster. Not even the TAs could solve that." Marcus Kim, who was already recording on his phone, muttered, "She's trying to destroy him." Dr. Sinclair capped the marker and turned back, arms crossed. "All right, Mr. Trump," she said with a smug grin, stepping aside to reveal the equation. "If merit is all that matters, then let's see you solve this." The tension in the room became suffocating. Even those who agreed with her earlier shifted uncomfortably. sensing the deliberate attempt to humiliate one of their classmates. Barron, however, remained unfazed. He rose from his seat, walked to the board, and studied the problem, his fingers lightly tapping the marker. He tilted his head slightly, deep in thought, before turning back to the class. Would you like the standard approach, or would you prefer a more efficient solution using Laplace's lesser-known theorem from 1771? A heavy silence followed. Dr. Sinclair's smirk faltered, the confidence in her eyes flickering. "You've studied Laplace's original papers?" she asked, her voice slightly strained. Barron nodded. The German translations lacked the elegance of his true methodology. He added casually. A few audible gasps filled the room. Without waiting for a reply, he began writing, each stroke of the marker precise, fluid, and impossibly fast. The class watched, mesmerized, as he didn't just solve the problem. He explained it with perfect clarity, making the impossible seem effortless. Dr. Sinclair, her arms still crossed, could only stare. What was meant to be his public humiliation had become something else entirely, his moment of undeniable genius. The only sound in the lecture hall was the smooth glide of Barron's marker against the board. His movements were deliberate, confident, each stroke revealing a clarity of thought that stunned the room into silence. Rather than rushing through the solution, he paused at key points, turning slightly toward the students, ensuring they understood. "This first step," he explained, his voice calm and steady, utilizes a technique developed by Euler in 1755. By reframing the integral using a more efficient substitution, we reduce the complexity significantly. A few students, including Emily Rhodes, scrambled to take notes, their brows furrowed in concentration. Even those who had initially dismissed him, like Nathan Carter, who had been smirking just minutes ago, found themselves leaning forward, hanging on to every word. Dr. Sinclair, still standing at the podium, gripped her arms tightly across her chest, her expression unreadable. Her carefully orchestrated trap was falling apart before her eyes, and she knew it. She had expected hesitation, embarrassment, failure, but instead Barron was delivering a masterclass in mathematics that no one, not even she, had anticipated. As Barron moved into the second phase of the problem, he took another brief pause, then turned toward Dr. Sinclair. "At this point, Professor," he said politely, "there are two possible paths forward. The traditional approach, which would take another full board to complete, or an alternative using Laplace's transformation, which would streamline the solution significantly." He met her gaze directly, his expression neutral, his tone genuine. "Which would you prefer?" The professor's jaw tightened. She had no answer. The challenge she had designed to publicly humiliate him had backfired spectacularly, and now the entire class was waiting for her response. Nathan Carter, still slouched in his seat, muttered under his breath, "There's no way." His voice lacked the arrogance from earlier. It was now tinged with disbelief. Before Dr. Sinclair could reply, Emily raised her hand, her voice hesitant but eager. Could we see both?" she asked. "The way you're explaining this, it actually makes sense." Several heads nodded in agreement, and murmurs of encouragement spread through the room. Students who had been intimidated by calculus for months were now seeing it in a new light, not as a rigid, incomprehensible field, but as something fluid, elegant, even beautiful. Dr. Sinclair's face paled, her authority over the room crumbling. This was supposed to be her class, her lesson, her power dynamic, but Barron had changed the entire narrative. Instead of simply proving her wrong, he had effortlessly stepped into the role of an educator, commanding more respect and admiration in a single lecture than she had in an entire semester. The final stroke of the marker sealed her fate. Barron boxed the final answer, stepping back and capping the pen. The equation, once a weapon against him, now stood as proof of his undeniable brilliance. The class erupted into spontaneous applause, students turning to one another in shock, excitement, and awe. Marcus Kim, who had been recording from the beginning, glanced at his phone screen. "This," he whispered, "is going viral." Dr. Sinclair stiffened as she realized that her defeat was now on camera for the entire world to see. The applause was deafening, echoing through the lecture hall as students exchanged stunned glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Barron Trump, the quiet figure who had sat at the back of the class for months, had just shattered every assumption about him. He hadn't just solved an impossible equation, he had commanded the room with his intellect, his humility, and his ability to teach what even the professor failed to articulate. Dr. Eleanor Sinclair, a woman known for her unyielding authority, stood frozen at the podium, her expression unreadable. The weight of what had just happened settled over her like a suffocating fog. This was supposed to be her moment of triumph, her way of proving a point, but instead, she had been publicly dethroned by the very student she sought to discredit. As the applause died down, Emily Rose rose from her seat, gripping her notebook. Her voice, though usually timid, carried a new strength. "Professor Sinclair," she said, her gaze unwavering, "I came to this class to learn calculus, not to be lectured about privilege." But a ripple of agreement spread through the room, with several students nodding, murmuring their own frustrations. Marcus Kim, who had captured the entire exchange on his phone, smirked as he scrolled through the video. "It's already getting shares," he muttered. "This is going to blow up." Dr. Sinclair's pale fingers tightened around the podium. She opened her mouth, perhaps to defend herself, but before she could speak, another voice rang out. Nathan Carter, the once arrogant student who had smirked at Barron's discomfort, now looked shaken. I don't get it," he admitted, rubbing his forehead. "He made it look so easy. I've been struggling with that stuff for weeks." He turned toward Barron, his earlier smugness replaced with something bordering on respect. Can you explain the last part again?" Barron, ever composed, simply smiled. He stepped back toward the board, grabbed the marker, and began breaking down the solution once more, not as a competitor proving a point, but as a peer willing to help. The real lesson of the day wasn't just about solving an equation. It was about the power of knowledge, about how true intelligence isn't just about winning an argument, but about lifting others up. Just then, the door to the lecture hall swung open, and in strode Dean Robert Langley, the head of the mathematics department. His piercing blue eyes swept over the scene, the murmuring students, the viral video playing on Marcus's phone, the tension hanging in the air like a charged wire. His gaze locked onto Dr. Sinclair, whose usually confident stance had crumbled. "Professor Sinclair," he said, his voice cool but authoritative, "I believe we need to have a discussion about the direction of this course." The class fell silent once more, the power dynamic shifting again. This time, however, it wasn't about who held the most authority. It was about who had truly earned the respect of the room. And in that moment, it was clear. It wasn't the professor. It was Barron Trump. A suffocating silence filled the room as Dean Robert Langley's words hung in the air. Dr. Sinclair, who had spent years commanding classrooms with an unshakable confidence, now looked visibly unsettled. Her grip on the podium tightened, her knuckles turning white as if bracing for impact. She had always believed that power in academia belonged to those who controlled the narrative, but now in front of her own students, that control had slipped away. "Dean Langley," she began, straining to keep her voice steady, "surely you don't mean to suggest that today's class was inappropriate?" The dean's gaze remained cold and unwavering. "Professor Sinclair," he said, his voice even but firm, "I just witnessed a classroom where a student, not the instructor, delivered the most profound mathematical lesson of the semester." He glanced at the whiteboard where Barron's flawless solution stood as a testament to what had just transpired. The purpose of a university is to challenge minds, not egos. A few students stifled their smirks, while others outright nodded in agreement. Marcus Kim, still holding up his phone, murmured, "This is the best thing I've seen all year." Emily Rhodes, emboldened by the moment, stood up once more. "With all due respect, sir," she said, glancing at the dean before turning toward the professor, "I think we've all learned more from Barron today than we have in the last 3 months of this course." The words landed like a hammer, not just for Dr. Sinclair, but for everyone in the room. Dr. Sinclair exhaled sharply, looking like she wanted to argue, but finding no ground to stand on. She was a tenured professor, yet she had been outshined by a student, one she had tried to humiliate. Her carefully constructed lesson on privilege had collapsed, exposed for what it truly was, a distraction from the real purpose of learning. But just as the tension seemed unbearable, Barron stepped forward, his posture composed, his voice free of malice. "Professor," he said, his tone measured, "your knowledge is impressive, and your passion for education is clear. Perhaps we could shift the focus back to what really matters, helping every student here become better at mathematics." His words, spoken without resentment or arrogance, caught everyone off guard. Even the dean seemed momentarily surprised. Dr. Sinclair, swallowing her pride, hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "Perhaps you have a point," she admitted, though the words seemed to cost her. She turned back to the class. "Let's return to the material," she said, her voice quieter, her stance less rigid. Barron gave a polite nod and returned to his seat, as if nothing monumental had just happened. But it had. That day, the power dynamics in the classroom shifted forever, not through arrogance or humiliation, but through grace, humility, and undeniable talent. The following weeks at Harvard University's mathematics department were unlike anything the students had ever witnessed. What had started as a tense power struggle between a renowned professor and a quiet student had evolved into a story that would be talked about for years. Marcus Kim's video, capturing Barron Trump's brilliant mathematical display and the professor's humiliating downfall, spread across social media like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it had amassed millions of views, igniting heated discussions across academic and political circles. Some praised Barron for standing his ground, while others criticized Dr. Sinclair for weaponizing her authority instead of fostering intellectual growth. Despite the viral sensation, Barron remained as composed as ever. He continued attending class, still sitting in the back row, still keeping to himself. Except now something had changed. Instead of ignoring him, students gravitated toward him. They sought his help before and after lectures, eager to understand calculus through his unique, clear explanations. Even those who had once dismissed him, like Nathan Carter, had set aside their arrogance, admitting that Barron had taught them more about mathematics in a single lesson than they had learned all semester. Dr. Sinclair, meanwhile, faced a reckoning of her own. The mathematics department launched an internal review of her teaching methods, questioning whether she had prioritized ideology over education. Though she retained her position, it was clear that her influence had weakened. She no longer spoke about privilege or social justice during lectures. Instead, she stuck to what truly mattered: mathematics. And though she would never openly admit it, her interactions with Barron became less adversarial, more professional, even subtly respectful. One afternoon, as class wrapped up, Dean Langley approached Barron, who was helping Emily Rhodes work through a complex proof. "Mr. Trump," the dean said, his voice carrying a rare note of admiration, "I've been at this university for 30 years, and I've never seen a student command a classroom the way you did that day." He paused, his piercing gaze studying Barron. "Have you ever considered teaching?" Barron simply smiled, shaking his head. "Not officially," he said, capping his pen, "but if anyone needs help, I'm always happy to share what I know." That simple statement summed up everything. Barron had never sought to prove anyone wrong or humiliate his professor. His only goal had been to defend the integrity of learning, to ensure that merit, not ideology, dictated academic success. That was why the students respected him. That was why the dean saw in him something rare and invaluable. The next day, when Barron arrived in class, he found something new on the board, written in bold letters: Welcome to Harvard's most competitive calculus course, where only merit matters. And this time, no one questioned it. At the end of the day, this story isn't just about Barron Trump, a calculus problem, or a viral moment. It's about something much bigger. It's about standing your ground, about proving that real talent, hard work, and intelligence still matter in a world that sometimes tries to rewrite the rules. Barron didn't argue, didn't fight, didn't play the victim. He just let the numbers speak for themselves. And that's the kind of power no one can take away from you. The lesson? Knowledge is the great equalizer. It doesn't care about your last name, your background, or the opinions of those who want to put you in a box. In today's world, too many people focus on excuses instead of excellence, on politics instead of personal growth. But here's the truth. If you put in the work, if you master your craft, no one, not a professor, a boss, or a critic, can deny your ability. So ask yourself, are you ready to be the person who knows the answers when it matters most? If this story inspired you, hit like, subscribe, and share, because the world needs more people who stand for merit over mediocrity. Stay sharp, stay strong, and keep learning.